These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, an exploration of land as a fundamental component in Black liberation movements, past and present, with Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui and Dr. Willie Jamaal Wright. The Africa World Now Project is next. The question of land as a fundamental aspect of Africana liberation movements is an often neglected point of inquiry when exploring the long genealogy of Africana thought and behavior, radical or otherwise. Nevertheless, it is indeed ever present. A reading of the large cache of demands, treaties, and platforms of various communities of Africana people and organizations provide the historical reality of this fact. With this, a place that one can start and move forward or backwards is with, of course, Brother Malcolm. As his revolutionary praxis evolved, he once exclaimed that,
"Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward all research. And when you see that you got problems, all you have to do is examine the historic method used all over the world by others who had problems similar to yours. And once you see how they got theirs straight, then you know how you can get yours straight." Please. There's been a revolution, a black revolution going on in Africa. In Kenya, the Mau Mau were revolutionaries. They were the ones who made the word Uhuru. They were the ones who brought it to the fore. The Mau Mau, they were revolutionaries. They believed in scorched earth. They knocked everything aside that got in their path. And their revolution also was based on land. A desire for land. In Algeria, the northern part of Africa, a revolution took place. The Algerians were revolutionists. They wanted land. France offered to let them be integrated into France. They told France to hell with France. They wanted some land, not some France. And they engaged in a bloody battle. So I cite these various revolutions, brothers and sisters, to show you, you don't have a peaceful revolution. You don't have a turn the other cheek revolution. There's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. Only kind of revolution that's nonviolent is the Negro Revolution. The only revolution based on loving your enemy is the Negro Revolution. The only revolution in which the goal is a desegregated lunch counter, a desegregated theater, a desegregated park, and a desegregated public toilet. You can sit down next to white folks on the toilet. That's no revolution. Revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality.
Malcolm's ideas are firmly situated in the long tradition of early radical activists and thinkers such as Detroit attorney Milton Henry, the 19th century movements of Benjamin Pap Singleton, and of course the Communist Party's Black Belt Nation thesis, not to mention the efforts of the Republic of New Africa. Together, these and the many other efforts across the African world all center the question of land as being the fundamental component in Black liberation movements. We see this reality in communities in South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Brazil, Colombia, etc. Land is understood not in the limited capitalist sense of ownership, but the transmission of communal practices of human stewardship as being primary caretakers of the planet. Today we will explore the question of land and African world liberation with Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui and Dr. Willie Jamaal Wright. Dr. Siddiqui is an assistant professor of history at Winston-Salem State University, and Dr. Wright is an assistant professor of geography at Florida State University. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Enjoy the program. Welcome, Willie and Tasneem.
Peace. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.
We gathered here today to really talk about, I think, a much neglected part of understanding the struggle, which is the false binary between ideological and material objectives in Black liberation, but also in struggles globally. And what we wanted to talk about today is the question specifically of the importance of land, or the importance of space, or the importance of place in the context historically in Black liberation movement, but also some contemporary expressions of this historic long genealogy of the question of space, the question of place, the question of land, the importance of land in formulating any struggle, but also how it kind of informs, expands the ideas of ideological struggle as well. And I really, really wanted to take the time to really thank you both for joining us today to have this particular discussion. And I wanted to kind of throw this huge question out to you both. Willie, you can respond first, and then Tasneem, you can respond after. How do we go about centering the question of land as a fundamental component of African and diasporic social movements, specifically in the context of our social political moment as we are currently in right now? I know it's a huge question, but let's move historically, though. Let's move, and so, let's move and talk about actual historical expressions, and then we can move forward on that particular question. Cool?
Cool.
All right, Willie, you can go ahead and start first, and then we'll go with Tasneem.
I am going to start by kind of centering my response in my research, actually. So my work is on the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa. And the PGRNA is a Black revolutionary nationalist government that was formed in Detroit in 1968, right, with the express intent of creating a Black nation state within the confines of what we understand today as the United States. So the PGRNA argue that the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina are New Africa, right? Like that is the national territory for New Africans or Black folk in America. All right, so the two brothers, or two sort of the main thinkers that created the PGRNA, Imari Obadeli and Gaidi Obadeli, right? They were followers of Malcolm. And they saw themselves, them and other New African citizens saw themselves as materializing Malcolm's thoughts, which were not very concrete on what Black nationalism would look like, right? So the Obadeli brothers were thinking that Black nationalism within the context of the United States should materialize itself, right, spatially and politically as a Black nation state. And so they understood concretely, right, the significance of having land and in their spatial imaginary actually having a territory that could not only serve as like a social and economic base for Black folk in America, but also a political base from which New Africans could develop geopolitical relationships, right, with emerging nations throughout what was known then as the Third World. And so with my research, I'm curious as to the spatial legacies, right, the political and spatial legacies of those brothers and sisters that were mobilizing in the late 60s and the early 70s, specifically in Detroit where the RNA was formed, but also in Mississippi where many New African citizens moved to in order to actually materialize the nation. Like many New African citizens moved their families, moved their careers down to Mississippi, particularly Jackson, Mississippi, in order to begin to get hold of land and ultimately territory. And so to somewhat bring that forward, one of the ways in which I'm arguing that the RNA's political legacy exists today and the spatial legacy exists today is what we see happening in Jackson, Mississippi via the work of Cooperation Jackson, via the election of Chokwe Lumumba as the 50th mayor of Jackson, Mississippi in 2013, and even the more recent election of his son, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, as the next mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. And I argue that because Chokwe Lumumba was one of the key cadre members of the Republic of New Africa in the late 60s and early 70s, right? And so part of the rationale behind him moving south was not only, it was part of his rationale was because that was a tenet of the Republic of New Africa, as well as the New African People's Movement, People's Organization, right, which is an organization that formed following the kind of the downturn of the Republic of New Africa. So I think if we look historically at the ways in which different movement organizations went about, they not only engaged, right, in political education and political theorizing, but they saw the significance of grounding those political ideologies in some particular space, right? It allows you, I think it allows you to actually replicate what it is that the way in which you see your group, right? Like New Africans, in order to replicate themselves and their future as New Africans, they had to be grounded in some kind of place, in some land. And thinking about that in a contemporary sense, I always try to think about what's happening in terms of Black Lives Matter, the organization Black Lives Matter, and BYP 100, right, and the way in which they engage space. And these sisters and brothers are part of these organizations. They do so, but it's not in the same way, right? So it doesn't seem like there's a clear intent on gaining land, right, and territory, no matter what scale we want to look at it. But it seems as though with Black Lives Matter and BYP 100, right, there's a more fugitive relationship to space, right? So it's not a focus on owning or getting hold of land. It's like infiltrating certain spaces, right? Spaces of capital in particular.
And Willie, I wanted to pulling that particular point right there, this idea of fugitive space, and if I can pause for a second, because you're working through a very complex history here, which you're providing a very important contextualization. I want to pull in Tasneem in this particular point, because she takes this particular idea of the historical context to the Sea Islands, and we're talking about fugitive space. I know, Tasneem, your work kind of focuses on a more, this idea of fugitive space, because Willie, you're making this point here. You're talking about the idea of land, and we want to get to that. How do we understand land, not in a not commodified, right? As an idea of space, and we're going to get there. And thank you, Willie, for really getting to that particular point, and you're kind of jumping ahead on my questions too, but that's okay. That's okay, because and I want to bring Tasneem in to kind of take that and stretch it back, look at that historical genealogy a little bit back when we're talking about South Carolina, the Sea Islands, and that fugitive space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I'll just kind of frame my response also within my research, right? So just to kind of give you some, a brief overview. So my research really examines these sort of post-Reconstruction freedom struggles that were waged by rural Black American laborers in the South Carolina and Georgia's Low Country and coastal islands. So, for access to ownership of land. And so what I'm really trying to argue is that the struggle for land and a claim to place facilitates this form of communal life for racialized groups who faced systematic social marginalization in different phases of the development in the New South. And really trying to look at the ways in which Black communities after emancipation articulated their freedom. So the ways in which they articulated their freedom was through access to land, right? So, looking at sort of this shifting political grounds of Reconstruction, and there were also shifting, ideas in terms of what freedom actually meant. So you had sort of from the state, the 1865 state as it's starting to emerge, the state that we actually know now, that's articulating land for formerly enslaved communities as, articulating freedom as not this ownership of land, right? As articulating freedom into like these new sort of systems of wage labor as well. So Black communities themselves, through their struggle, right? So through this sort of struggle for land, is really articulating a struggle for our alternative way of life, alternative way of living, right? You have formerly enslaved or I'd like to actually use the term self-emancipated communities and self-emancipated people actually talking about having a divine right to land through this experience of bondage and chattel slavery as well. And in particularly the space of the Low Country and Sea Islands, I'm trying to also think through these older forms of Black American development traditions, right? So you have cooperatives, you have town building, you have land, access to land, you have, like these self-sustaining and self-determining communities as well, and linking them with, social movements. So trying to find like sort of like the daily link between life, the fight to create alternative forms of living and alternative forms of what it means to be human with social movements, right? And the knowledge that then is produced and the practices for our present historical moment, right? So you have, and I draw a lot on the work of, folks like Clyde Woods and Catherine McKittrick, and we can kind of talk about the ways in which sort of an analytic of Black geography really informs this work and informs this understanding of the ways in which people are thinking through what it means to have access to land, so, and sort of the different forms of land use as well, right? So it doesn't follow necessarily this articulation of sort of like land in terms of a Jeffersonian republic, right? It talks about land in terms of like communal land use, right? So you have multiple people, multiple communities actually owning plots of land and thinking about what that actually means in terms of, this simultaneously to what's happening, new iterations of racial capitalism as well. So that's sort of, and then thinking through how that historical trajectory then follows with different forms of early Black organizing and movement. So if we look to, the Niagara movement, we look at the UNIA, we look at like the different texts from the Pan-African Congress, everyone articulates the struggle for land, or the necessity and the need for land as like the central aspect of Black liberation struggle, right? But if we think about that, how that looks like contemporary, especially like with the left, there is a more of an emphasis on sort of gaining ideological clarity and less an emphasis or de-emphasis on really, the historical, the historical consciousness of everyday Black folks who are actually just trying to fight for life, right? So what are the material realities of life, and how do we get access to those resources?
Let me pause you for a second here, because you guys are getting at the crux of what we're talking about here, right? And Willie, you mentioned this earlier, this conceptualization of land. Let's pull back and let's talk about that within the context of how is land really conceptualized within the context of the African diasporic experience. Is it a capitalist? Is it a ownership? Dr. Siddiqui just talked about this communal aspect, or this communal component, this cultural component of the shared idea, or the idea of shared land. Can you talk a little bit more about that, or can you guys, kind of give that particular perspective? Because it seems to me that land is looked at differently. It's not looked at as a commodification. It's looked at as identity, as survival, as something more.
Yeah. So Tasneem had mentioned, right, like in her description of Black geographies, right, how it counteracts the given conceptions and relationships to land as a commodity to be owned, right? Like communities oftentimes are not seen as spatial, right, or valuable unless, right, the property itself has value. And what Black geographies as an analytic does, it looks to the different ways in which Black communities throughout the diaspora engage space and also produce it, right? So and many times, so if you look through work on Black geographies, or you go to Black communities, the way in which oftentimes Black communities engage spaces is through its use value, right? So like we may not own the property in our neighborhood, but we all use it in certain kind of ways, right? It has a use value to our community and to our culture, and so that's one of the key interventions that Black geographies makes. But thinking about the way in which land is addressed, thought of throughout the diaspora. So I'm in a geography department. I did my master's in Pan-African Studies, and my thesis was on Black land loss in Kentucky. So I was interviewing Black farmers. But it wasn't until I got into this geography department that I realized a lot of my classmates were doing research in Colombia and Peru and other places. And the Black communities they were working with were always talking about territory, right? And that was like kind of the first time I even started to think about territory and what that meant. So in questioning, like, why do Black folk here in the U.S. Why is our central focus on land, right? Like farmers focus on land ownership, right? That is important for agriculturalists as opposed to thinking about territory. So there are various conceptions of our relationship to land and how it can serve to replicate our livelihoods, right? Our cultures. I think I kind of lost track on the tail end of your question there.
No, we were talking about this idea of the conceptualization of land. No, you're right on it. And Dr. Siddiqui, Tasneem, you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I wanted to actually also think about, the Black radical tradition, right? So, Cedric Robinson talks about sort of the nature of the Black radical tradition and Black Marxism. And it's really important that, this is what, for me, even growing up as I'm a descendant of Black farmers from Mississippi, right? And sort of like that profound loss of land, right? But it's not framed in the same way in terms of, like, I would say, through the logics of racial capitalism. It's informed in terms of something like there's a spiritual element to it. There's a spiritual component to it. And I think a lot about, so when Cedric Robinson talks about, the preservation of the ontological totality, and he's talking about, that it's granted by this metaphysical system that had never allowed for property in either the physical, philosophical, temporal, legal, social, or psychic senses, right? And so I think a lot about, this spiritual component, especially when I'm looking at the Low Country and Sea Islands, the Gullah and Geechee communities as well, right? There are places, this struggle and this fight and this preservation for land. And I was talking to actually one of my students, and her family's from Sierra Leone, and so a lot of communities in the Gullah Geechee communities are descendants of people from Sierra Leone. And, we were having this conversation about land, and she's like, the spirits are in the land when people die, right? The people and the land become one. There's this interdependent relationship, right? So our being is tied to nature. But I want to kind of unpack that a little bit more. We can unpack that in our conversation, because the ways that sort of Western philosophy then looks at looks at the nature of non-white communities and how they sort of like tie them to nature. It's a different response, right? It's more of this interdependence, this sort of custodianship, this stewardship that is established with this relationship to land, right? That our ancestors are still infused in these places, right? Their energy is in these places as well. Our life, our ways of life, our histories, right? So it's so much deeper than our identities are sort of attached to place, right? So that's sort of one of the ways that, I'm kind of thinking through, even for myself, this importance to land, and not necessarily in the way of like property ownership, right? But in the way of like how we constitute ourselves as a people.
Willie, you wanted to add to that?
Right. So Tasneem had mentioned, like she stated, like how our being is tied to nature. It reminded me of a conversation I was having with Dr. Akinyele Umoja, who's chair of African American Studies at Georgia State University, and we were talking about the Republic of Africa and like present day manifestations and just people to this day, right, moving to Jackson based off of this long history. And I remember him telling me that, that the South in general, right, this is what he said, the South is where our Ashe is, right? That's where our ancestors are, both, right, in the material sense, right? Because our ancestors are now, the land is our ancestors in like a material sense, but also spiritually, right? That's where our ancestors lie. But building on that notion of like land as being more than a commodity, right? More than its exchange value, if you will. And, I'm thinking about that more in terms of my hometown. So I'm born and raised in Houston, Texas, and my neighborhood back home, Third Ward, has this long history of like this long blues and jazz tradition, and more recently through the art of John Biggers, it's kind of a seat of like Black artists, performance artists, and visual artists. And so I'm thinking about the way in which they use public space back home in Third Ward and how that relates to the massive wave of gentrification that's like flooding our neighborhood. So like Third Ward is one of the more recent seats of gentrification in Houston. And I'm trying to think about the ways in which these artists, through their performances, right, through the way in which they engage in public performances in the neighborhood, through their visual art, they are articulating a particular kind of spatial imaginary that is based on the use value of that public space, right? It's not about how much money we can get out of this plot of land. It's about the fact that this plot of land has served as a spot where the elders would come and sit under the shade tree since we were kids. And how did that influence the way we think about our art? And how does that challenge, right, the notions of development that are being brought into our neighborhood from developers, from the municipality that's giving them the subsidies, right, from the niche coffee shops and everything that are starting to pop up. And we see this in like major cities all throughout the country, right? So we see the way in which Black communities, brown communities, working class communities are seen as aspatial, right? They're seen as not having value because people's understanding of land and value is tied to how much money, how much it's worth in its property, as opposed to what it's worth to the people that have been existing there for generations.
So we're having this conversation sitting in a settler colony, right? We're having this conversation sitting in the midst of a project that took land from the indigenous people, that appropriated and not only appropriated and took land, but imposed cultural norms and values on the relationship between labor and land. And of course, we know that long historical. But let's back up. How do we look at what is Black geographies? Because again, I think it's important to kind of conceptualize and to really unpack a lot of what we're talking about. Because at times we tend to have very, very heady conversations, and I think it's important to kind of really because what we're talking about here is things that we all have in our family history, right? These things are really real to us. We're talking about it within the context of a certain intellectual context, but me myself, I think of Gramsci, the organic. I think everybody's intellectuals, but how do we unpack? Let's unpack that idea of Black geographies and this idea of space, and within that question, Willie, I want you to kind of expand this idea of creating space or reappropriating space with the cultural production of Black people. But while you're thinking about that, Willie, Tasneem, kind of talk about this idea of Black geography.
Okay, sure. So the way that I come to think about Black geography is like I start with really the Black radical tradition. So I might be a little bit, so I will, let me sort of put a disclaimer first. I am not a geographer.
Everybody's a geographer.
I know. You know that, yeah, right. So I know my advisors would be like, everything is geographic. But professionally. So I really kind of locate it within the Black radical tradition, right? So we talk about the Black radical tradition a lot, but in terms of like thinking about the Black radical tradition as this field of knowledge, right? A field of knowledge production and revolutionary social imagination, but also actual struggle, like the struggle for liberation. And then, the Black radical tradition really centers its object of critical study, and is also shaped by, not the nature of the Black radical tradition, but shaped by this logic of mass dehumanization, right? That underwrites the universal emancipatory conceits of modern, Western, also red, white, bourgeois notions of social organization and sociality, right? And so we think about the ways that radical intellectuals within this field have revealed this tradition through, as I said, like the collective struggles for liberation in the historical consciousness of Black masses, right? Where, as Cedric Robinson always sort of pointed out, that this struggle was more than words or ideas, but life itself. So I kind of connect this, thinking about the Black radical tradition to this emerging field of Black geographies that really sort of, I understand it as extending this tradition of work to engage and locate, and I'll use the words of a Caribbean intellectual, Sylvia Winter, so really describing the terrain of political struggle itself, or where the imperative of perspective of struggle takes place. And so she really frames these logics in, the mass dehumanization, and as I said, the universal sort of emancipatory conceits of Western modernity as always already geographic, right? That the struggle for liberation is multiscalar, it's a geographic struggle, and that is like, that place is the site of political struggle. So going back and knowing the late Clyde Woods, and how he, was really like, you need to talk about the South. Black students don't want to talk about the South, but you need to talk about the South. So, but the ways that Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods had theorized this field of study they had an edited anthology of Black geographies and the politics of place. And they really examined also Black expressive culture. So music, literature, poetry, religious practices, everyday life, to understand the ways that Black diasporic communities responded to institutionalized violence by creating and preserving social action, social explanations, intellectual and aesthetic traditions, with really the potential to articulate a praxis for realizing global social justice. So for my understanding, and for me, a project of Black geography really specifically considers like this philosophical complexity of the various ethnic ontologies, as Clyde Woods would say, and the traditions of geographic thought that are implicit within them. And that's really when we sort of, to circle back around, and when we started the conversation, to also uncover these links between daily life and social movements, which provides us with not only geographic knowledge, but geographic like spatial practices as well.
And that ties right into this idea of what Willie, I mean, you can tell me if I'm wrong, like you're looking at this material expression of this long genealogy of struggle and the question of land and place in the resistance and this reappropriating space with Black cultural production.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so if I could kind of Veggie backing off of what Tasneem has said in terms of I think one of the really important things that's happening in this field in Black geographies is that scholars are thinking about the ways in which space is produced outside of given notions in terms of like land ownership. Like land ownership is not the only way in which we engage in no space. And Clyde Woods, right, in Development Arrested, his book Development Arrested, is arguing that because Black folk were spatially contained, right, within the Jim Crow South and spatially annihilated, that they came up with other ways in which to dream about what equitable spatial development would look like. And so he suggests that the blues itself, if you listen to the lyrics of the blues, it is actually Black folk, Black sharecroppers articulating their dreams for like spatial development in the South, right? Like how in which they want to live and engage space in the South outside of a containing system of Jim Crow. And so that's why when we read these works in Black geography, they're commenting on musicians, they're commenting on artists, they're commenting on literary figures. Catherine McKittrick does that a lot, right? Like she's always referring to a poet and the way in which that poet or that writer is creating space in their prose and whatnot. And so, but with Black geographies, I like to think of it as both an analytic, right? It is like this kind of framework from which we can understand the world around us. But before that, it is an analog, right? It is an actual
Right.
physical production, right?
Right.
And Clyde Woods draws from Richard Wright, particularly Richard Wright's time that he spent in the Mississippi Delta, right? And learning from or just experiencing and writing about Black folk in the South and the way in which they lived in space, right? So Black geographies, you mentioned, like we grew up with Black geographies, right? The Black geography is that little spot, that well-worn shade tree spot where people gather. That's a Black geography, and it has its own meaning. It has its own value that is not tied to how much money we can make off of it or someone else can make off of it. You know, the Black geography is your grandma's living room, right? Where everybody convened, right? And like, what is it about that living room that made you feel a certain way, that had a certain kind of value tied to it? So thinking about the ways in which many Black folk within Black communities, because right, we've been isolated and pushed out of traditional forms of land ownership, that we begin to think about and engage space in other ways. And so in Houston, I think about that through artists. Like, how are these like artists that are coming up in Third Ward speaking to their neighborhood, about their neighborhood, right, through their art, in opposition to these the gentrifiers and the developers that are coming in wholesale without any understanding or care, right, for the people that have been living in this neighborhood for generations.
Tasneem, you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that was good.
My bad, James. You did mention something about like the replication, like cultural production.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This book I had recently read. So I recently did this study group with El Quilombo. Quilombo is a community organization that's based in Durham, and they recently did this study group on the history of the Zapatista movement. So we read this book called "Critical Thought in the Face of the Capitalist Hydra" 1. And it's written by Zapatistas, and they're writing about their own historical, cultural, spatial development, right, in southern Mexico. And one thing that struck me about the book and just the conversations we had is that the Zapatistas talk about how their ability to last, right, over decades and generations was, one, in part because they were based in a particular physical geography, right? They were based on a certain kind of landscape, but also because they were based in a particular landscape that was seen as valueless, right, by the capitalists in Mexico, right? So they were up in the mountains, like in this area that's hard to live in, like a very seemingly unhospitable environment. And it's because they decided to settle themselves there. They were given time, in a way, right, to replicate themselves. And this is something I'm thinking through in some ideas I have now. But we see the same thing with maroon communities, right?
Right.
So when you read up on maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp, right, the Great Dismal Swamp was hard, in an inhospitable place, right? And it was only, it took a while for capitalists to figure out a way in which they could go in and drain the swamp in order to harvest timber. But for a while, it was a place where fugitive slaves or formerly enslaved and folk to go to and create another vision of a world, or create a whole nother world actually within that dismal space.
Right. And the same thing is happening, in the Low Country and Sea Island. So prior, like, that was an area where even when it was, sort of the height of rice production, right? So you had quite a bit of like absentee planters because of the, because it wasn't seen as a uninhabitable space, right? So you had the yellow fever, you had malaria that was pretty rampant in those areas. And then even after you see the decline of rice production because of what Du Bois calls the greatest general strike, the Civil War. And so, producing rice in that region was no longer tenable, right? But in those areas, and also afforded Black communities in those areas ability to actually, live on their ancestral land, what became their ancestral land too, because it was uninhabitable, right? So, the land became, for sort of those large commodity crops became unproductive, right? But then you only see towards like the mid 20th century, right? So when you see the technologies of air conditioning, when you start to see the state actually appropriating those lands for military infrastructure as well, that you start to see sort of like mass sort of like colonization of those areas, either through tourist development or through suburban colonization or suburban, housing developments and things like that. In the late 1800s, you would see, in the early 1900s, you see like, folks like the Rockefellers or the Carnegies or the Candlers who are part of the Coca-Cola magnate and things like that in Georgia, using these particular parts of the land for sort of their sort of like resorts or like country homes, but they would only come to that area like 6 months out of the year or something like that. But it's only when you actually see, very similar to what Willie was talking about in terms of like the Zapatista movement, where Black communities are actually able to make life and cultivate themselves, right, and actually make those lands productive, that then you see sort of the infiltration of capital and the state then appropriating these lands, dispossessing people of these lands, because also these new modes of technologies that allow them to make those areas productive and inhabitable, right? And so this is something that is continuous, right? I mean, Gullah Geechee people are still struggling for the preservation of their land, right? And then if you see like sort of like tourist advertisements, right, they use it sort of like this throwback to this, antebellum nostalgia, but you really see the invisibility and marginalization of these communities that made that land productive, right? That was in an uninhabitable space too. So there's something to sort of this these lands of these areas being uninhabitable and then becoming inhabitable, right? And then what that means for their means of survival.
This leads us to, also the idea of gentrification, because of course, we have this deeming of inhabitable, spaces, specifically where there are predominantly people of color, Black people. Mm-hmm. We see the idea of labeling this. So the use of land by those settler minded authority becomes very, very important of how they kind of devalue or kind of like create a sense of devaluation in the spaces that Black people live, but then at the same time come in and gentrify those particular spaces. I often these conversations about gentrification, I'm really looking at those in a more critical sense, just because it seems to be continuous, right? We have conversations, we have books, we have shows, we have a lot of conferences that kind of look at this idea of gentrification, but are we looking at it properly? Are we conceptualizing it within the context of commodified land, meaning that we want to stay here so we can benefit from that, or we want to stay here because we want to use this land as a spiritual but also a material expression of our spiritual relationship to land?
So with the question of gentrification, right, it's a cycle too, right? It's not like it just stops, it's like it booms for a while, it wanes. Neighborhoods, like the property value neighborhoods are allowed to go down, to like pennies on a dollar, and it starts over again. And what I've begun thinking about recently and wanting to act on at some point in the very near future is like you said, bro, like we talk about it a lot. Like many books have been written about it, more books will be written about it. But it's like those of us who know, right, who understand what is happening, like what actions are we taking, like where do we live, right? And I think in some way I'm like kind of self-critical of myself. I think back, I was like, man, if I had known this, like what was about to happen to my neighborhood back, I would have like took out a huge student loan and like bought a bunch of, just so that those spaces wouldn't have been, what they are today.
Right.
But so many of us now have this understanding, and so I'm like, okay, like, what can we do? Like, well, maybe something that needs to be done now is like we need to reorient where we are living, right? We need to be living amongst the people who we write about, the people who we,
Right.
who to whom we are oriented, right? Like that's where we need to be, right? In
Right.
order to
Don't look
not
at
only kind of protect those spaces, but also work in concert with the people who've been like creating life there all this
right.
time.
Right.
Which goes into a very, very important because you guys mentioned Catherine McKittrick's work. Willie, you use it, and you mentioned it a couple of times. Can you discuss the ways that her particular work, specifically Demonic Grounds, Black Women and Cartographies of Struggle, can you discuss the ways the Republic of New Africa kind of asserted or kind of, looked at this idea of claim to place, not naturally followed by material ownership and Black repossession, but rather a grammar of liberation? Can you talk about that as we kind of move into another phase of this conversation?
Right, right. And on the surface level, we can say that the RNA, the Provisional Republic of New Africa, were in some ways replicating, right, the nation state model that existed, right? They were replicating the geopolitical model with presidents and vice presidents and whatnot, but it was more so of a anti-geopolitics or a subaltern geopolitics, right? They were trying to think of a way to use that governing structure to facilitate Black liberation, right? And obviously there were other formations, Black political formations that saw otherwise, right? The Black Panther Party were thinking about a more intercommunal form of Black liberation. But what I find significant and I think even useful to this day is that one of the claims and practices of the PGRNA is that they were wanting to get land in order to create what they were calling new communities, right? And these new communities would be these cooperative communities created by new African citizens, right? So they would build the infrastructure. They were, actively putting out flyers and encouraging new Africans to come south, whether you were a carpenter or a teacher, whether you were a doctor or a lawyer, it didn't matter what your skill was. They were imploring folks to come south so we can create these sustainable communities ourselves, right, based on Ujamaa, right, based on African socialism, right, and so moving forward and thinking about what's happening in Jackson today, right, we see Cooperation Jackson making a push to create these networks of cooperatively owned businesses. There's the cooperative community of New West Jackson, which is a separate cooperative community in Jackson, Mississippi, that is founded by New Africans, right? So we see that spatial imaginary of trying to use land or even territory, but an attenuated scale, a smaller scale of territory to create some, I don't want to call it safe space, but to use that space as a way in which to kind of replicate one's political and spatial ideology.
Tasneem, you wanted to add, or you wanted to kind of expand that particular conversation? I mean, you mentioned McKittrick's work as well, and how did it inform, your particular vision of work?
Yeah, no, sure. So, and I think that, so like when Willie was talking about the Republic of New Africa, so in similar ways, because I look at in more kind of localized areas, like in Georgia and South Carolina, these developments of Black communities, like sort of Black settlements too. And in one in particular, I look at it's called the Belleville settlement. And similarly, these communities, they had created their own constitution, right? So they created their own constitution. They have, their own sort of, courts, the constables. They have their own legislature, right? But they're also cooperative, right? So they're in the Belleville settlement. It's, everyone is, no one person, I should say, owned the land, right? They in this situation, they were actually leasing this plantation. But what's important in that area is the ways and the modes of their social organization, even though they're using some of the language of the time, right? The way that it was articulated or materialized was very different, right? So the ways that they actually socially organized, the types of political formations that they were trying to create in that moment was more based on the sense of communalism, as opposed to sort of like this hyper individualism, right? So and there are ways that I want to, and it's a little bit more difficult when you're dealing with like post Reconstruction communities as well, just in terms of like trying to access archival material, because a lot of the time it's like you only sort of have to sort of vet your study through, various state apparatus as well, right? So like the actual writing and theorizing and thinking about how these what is the function or what is the thought around these different modes of political formations or social organizing, then requires to some modes of speculation as well, right? But just through, what they were actually able to achieve. So I see, just, so from our conversation and then, doing some research on cooperation to action, but they're also able to achieve a fair amount of political power in those areas. And there's this correlation with them being able to achieve this type of political power and then being able to create self-determining communities, semi-autonomous communities in those areas too, right? So the fact that most of the sort of political offices at that time in this area, and it's mostly in Natchitoches County, Darien, in Georgia, were predominantly like Black office holders, right? So that afforded the ability for communities like that to actually exist. You start to see the diminishment of those communities as you see the sort of, Jim Crow starting to consolidate itself, right? That happens unevenly in the South, but it starts to consolidate. So you see sort of like this, what is quote unquote the return of home rule, right? So the ways that white supremacy functions in terms of terrorizing and intimidating and wielding violence to take over control of these political offices in particular parts of the city and the county. But when you had, Black political control over these areas, you start to see more sort of vibrant community formations and community settlements that don't then replicate sort of the nation state, of the ways that the nation state functions and racial capitalism functions in various parts of the South.
So I wanted to because Willie, you brought this and I did not want to leave this conversation because Willie made this point earlier about the geopolitical formation, the idea of creating, I guess kind of blowing up this concept of the nation state within the European sense. Willie, can you talk a little bit more about the Republic of New Africa and this geopolitical formation, and that obviously has an international component or internationalist component. What is the importance of the internationalists having an internationalist outlook and solidarity, substantive solidarity, not just the tweeting or the aesthetic of solidarity, but the idea of substantive solidarity with other people who are fighting for their land, such as in Colombia, South Africa, Brazil, and other places, because I know these themes carry on across the world. Can you talk a little bit more about this idea, the geopolitical, this internationalist component that is obviously implicit in the formation of the Republic of New Africa and their work and their objectives?
Yeah, so early New Africans and even New Africans to this day, right, they were Pan-Africanists, right? They were, speaking up Brother Malcolm again. It's like, right, he stated that, Black folk in America could not be free until Africans were free, right? Africans in Africa were free and vice versa. And so, like, the Obadeli brothers and New African citizens took that to heart, right? And one way we see the new Republic of New Africa's geopolitical kind of reach and solidarity is through the movement, right, or the connections that his first president, so Robert F. Williams, who was from North Carolina, former head of NAACP chapter in Monroe, North Carolina, was voted in as the first president of the Republic of New Africa, right? And this was while he was in exile, right? He had fled a trumped-up kidnapping charge in North Carolina. First, he went to Cuba, right? He went to Castro's Cuba, received asylum there, where he started Radio Free Dixie and was reporting back to revolutionaries here in the U.S. from Cuba. From there, he went to the People's Republic of China, went to Mao's China, received asylum there, and subsequently ended up in Tanzania, or what is now Tanzania. And so the RNA, he was elected as president partly because of his stance against white supremacy here in the U.S., but they also saw that he was making these geopolitical connections, right, with anti-capitalist governments abroad, right, and they saw that as a potential for getting the Republic of New Africa recognized within the United Nations, right. It was a key aim of some of the governmental members of the provisional government was to get recognition from these emerging nations, right, in Africa and Latin America, right, to recognize the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa as a bona fide geopolitical entity, thereby protecting themselves from the onslaught, right, that they knew was going to come from within the United States government. And so I think that is something that we can learn from today, right? Like, how do we create these these relationships, these substantive relationships across geopolitical boundaries? And I think one way is that when you look back in history, the people that we uphold and who we read about were constantly traveling to other countries. They were constantly leaving, going abroad, studying elsewhere, developing relationships, right, with revolutionaries and thinkers elsewhere to influence and inform how they moved when they came back home. And I think that's something that we need to embody more and more today.
Mm-hmm. Tasneem, did you want to add before we kind of close this conversation out? And of course, this is not going to be the end of this conversation because there are many, many more points that we probably can talk about specifically, kind of look at the more contemporary forms of these particular expressions as well.
Right. No, and I think that's important in terms of thinking about sort of the international connections that we have in terms of our struggles for liberation and for lands. But I'm constantly reminded also of sort of this charge that Clyde Woods had talked to me about. And that was the fact that sometimes we think about those communities that don't have that access to move and to travel, right? That are sort of in some ways and which are trying to negotiate their containment within space, right? And also looking at what are the forms of thought and social practices, geographic thought and social practices that also emerge from that, right? So a lot of our communities don't have access to travel, right? Have never traveled, don't have passports, right? But are still theorizing and are still sort of, articulating different modes of political subjectivities within these spaces, right? So I guess for me, I'm trying to reconcile those two, or try to negotiate how we then move, especially for our historical moment, and then how we fight for our futures, right?
Which becomes very, very important because, the question is what does it look like beyond struggle? But also, are those who are engaged in struggle, who claim to be engaged in struggle, do they really understand what struggle means and what it all entails, because a lot of times we have individuals who claim to be radical, and also, and Willie was you said a very, very important point earlier, is that you're self-critical. I tend to be self-critical as well, constantly gauging, my thoughts and actions, and constantly gauging, how we're moving, but also not only within individualists, but also in a collective sense. And I think that becomes very, very important because, again, we didn't get to specific That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms, email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com, or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist, Mwiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent, Funa Ngunda, senior researcher and content contributor, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.